Good afternoon. Hopefully you've had a very enjoyable morning session. I certainly found it very informative and very exciting. Chairman's privilege, I suppose. I think this session is going to be even better. Knowing some of the speakers personally, having spoken to them just a few moments ago and also on many occasions previously, they've got lots of thoughts they want to share with you. They've got lots of ideas. We do have a very diverse afternoon in terms of content. So we've got policymakers, we've got practitioners, we've got researchers, all around a very different theme in terms of how we actually make these cities work and actually bringing them to life in terms of case studies and ideas. And so a very different kind of focus for this afternoon. I'm going to move the agenda around a little bit because I'm mindful that after we hear from Chris and Kate, we haven't actually created time for questions and answers. And knowing what they're going to be talking about, I know you're going to want to question like hell. So we're going to create a little bit of space there before then we go into the panel debate. So I'm Martin Townsend, and my role is to try and keep us on time. So I will be indicating to the panelists if we go off timescales. What I need to do, though, is I don't just want to make this an interesting afternoon session. I want to make it an outstanding session, which means that you in the audience really do need to come up with those thought-provoking questions. And I know the panelists respond better when you come up with those questions that you've been saving up all day and maybe even all week to actually make sure that you can actually get real views and strong ideas from the people we're going to hear from this afternoon. So that's the contract between you and I. You need to come up with the questions and I'll make sure that everything runs smoothly. So no more to do. I'm going to introduce Kate. Kate, if you don't know, is the CEO of Town and Country Planning Association. Kate and I have worked on a number of occasions. In fact, we worked quite recently at a Westminster event where we managed to convince the parties before, was it March, wasn't it, that they needed to work together. Since then, they seem to have done completely the opposite. So I know Kate is very convincing in terms of her knowledge and her skills in terms of the planning system, what needs to change. And you're going to be talking about social issues and that agenda, looking from a different perspective from what we heard from this morning. So over to you, Kate.
Great, so thank you very much for inviting me along to join you this afternoon. As Martin said, I am very much going to focus on the role planning can play in creating better places for people to live. How planning can impact on your life chances, your health, your well-being, your educational attainment. And I'm going to talk you through a project that we led about 18 months ago, a year-long research study, and where that fits in with the debate today. But to start with, I thought it would be useful to say a gentle reminder about where planning came from. Planning came from Victorian England. It came out as a movement. It was an idea of combining utopian ideas with environmental protection and a radical idea about redistributing resources for ordinary people. It was against a backdrop of pretty tough conditions in Victorian England. When we look back at the slums that were in parts of London where people were living in very overcrowded conditions, very poor sanitation, paying very high rents. We also had issues in our rural areas of social isolation, of low wages, of poor connectivity. And it was against that backdrop that the Garden City movement formed and the TCPA was founded. So this is sort of the late 1890s. If we go back a decade before that, we had people like Charles Booth, assisted by Beatrice Webb, mapping areas of poor environmental quality, particularly in East London. And this work that I'm about to talk to you about comes out of a collaboration between the TCPA and the Webb Memorial Trust. And the Webb Memorial Trust was founded in memory of Beatrice Webb, who was a socialist reformer and campaign on equality and on social justice issues. And it's been a really powerful and interesting collaboration looking at the question, what role can planning have in tackling inequality and social issues. So the study itself looks at 4 different case studies. And all too often when we think about cities, we think about smart cities, we think about technology, we think about the City of London and financial growth. But actually within our cities, there's a very mixed picture, and there's a very mixed picture across Britain itself in terms of where our cities are going, the opportunities within them. So I'm going to talk through each of these case studies very, very briefly, just to set a bit of context of what role planning has played and what it's like in some of these areas. So starting with Anfield. So Anfield's in Liverpool, Liverpool's 6th largest city, a city planned for 1 million people, once an industrial powerhouse, has experienced population decline between the 1930s right up to sort of 2000. It's had great retail-led regeneration. It's had great cultural-led regeneration. But when you go to somewhere like Anfield, there's a very, very different picture. Anfield's an inner-city community. It's characterised by terraced houses, but it's incredibly disadvantaged over a whole range of indicators, from unemployment through to health, through to disability. And at the moment, child poverty is rising. So the average level of child poverty in Anfield is 43%, but in some parts of that ward, it goes up to 60%. Over a third of the population, adult population, have absolutely no qualifications. This is a very typical picture that you would see in the press of Anfield. Anfield was one of the flagship housing market renewal pathfinder areas of the previous government. It was designated in 2002. The aim was for about 30 to 40 million public investment to leverage in around 300 million private sector investment. What happened? Well, in 2011, the project got cancelled. And what you see is some areas have been demolished, some areas have been abandoned, but perhaps most shocking is the streets that you walk down where there's one family living in a house and 3/4 of the houses next to it are boarded up, and then there'll be another family. And you've got to ask, what's it like for the child growing up on that street? And is it acceptable for us to walk away from these places? Now, when we were there talking to the people involved in this, huge commitment was shown from the planners, from the regeneration specialists, but also from the community. And again, what you hear in the press is that people didn't want demolition. Actually, there was such extensive consultation that a lot of this community wanted more demolition. They wanted better quality houses. They wanted a better future. But this project really shows how vulnerable housing market renewal was to political and policy change. But it's also worth saying that some brilliant stuff happened. And actually, lots of myths are around housing market renewal. Actually, for every 1 home demolished, 6 were refurbished. Also, housing is still being built in the area. It's albeit at a slower pace, but positive things are happening. When you go to communities as well, there is huge social capital. This is an example of a project called 2 Up, 2 Down. It's a local bakery. It's opposite the football stadium. And they are a community cooperative who've come up and are campaigning for a better Anfield. But when you look at Anfield and you look at what's happened, particularly over the last 5 years, the shape and the fate of this community has absolutely been down to housing market renewal over the recent history. It was a generational programme. If you stop a generational programme a quarter of the way through, what happens? Abandonment. But there were also very important lessons about removing regional planning. What is there now strategically to focus investment in places like Anfield? There's nothing in the planning system. There was also very interesting feedback between planners and regeneration professionals. The regeneration professionals were seen as the go-getters, the people who brought the money in, who did the exciting stuff, and the planners were seen as the bureaucrats. When did we lose sight that it's actually the same profession and that we're all interested in creating great places, and it shouldn't be either or? There's also some very interesting lessons in terms of corporate social responsibility and the role of Liverpool Football Club, who call themselves a global community, but actually their investment in the local community is pretty appalling. Second case study here is Shirebrick. in Derbyshire. Shirebrook's one of 4 towns in Bolsover district. It has a population of about 10,000. Former mining town, the pit closes, the jobs go, and this is a town that's really, really suffering in terms of educational attainment, in terms of employment, in terms of aspiration. 41% of adults have no qualifications whatsoever. It's characterised by some pretty interesting housing. There's a model village, some regeneration has happened. There's also a relatively high proportion of housing that's now in a pretty bad state of disrepair. And one of the issues here was that when the pit closed and the coal board stock transferred the housing that was there, it went to many, many private sector landlords, and there's a real problem now of rogue landlords of keeping the upkeep of the housing in good condition. And again, that's really affected the mood and the aspiration of the place. But perhaps the most distinctive regeneration issue in Shirebrook is the town centre. Now, this site here, which is a pub, as you can see, it was 1970s social housing. It was given planning consent to a major retailer in 2010. The major retailer came and did fairs in the town centre, offering employment. People signed up to have local jobs. 5 years on, that retailer has just pulled out. These buildings have been demolished. What happens to the community now? And there's a really big question about the role in which planning can play in terms of shaping that future. Third case study is Middleton. Middleton is an interwar suburb to the south of Leeds. Now, Leeds is a really successful city, 3rd largest in the country, and the housing in this suburb in Middleton is actually really pretty good. It was built in that interwar period along Garden City Principle lines, but again, this area had been entirely dependent on a colliery, and the pit closed in the late 60s. What you have now is a pretty good landscape, a pretty good urban environment in terms of decent space standards, nice green spaces. But with that pit closure, there was a really rapid decline in terms of jobs, and now there's fairly entrenched poverty. And what the people feel when you talk to them there, is that Leeds is entirely a 2-speed city. You can be in the urban hub and feel really positive and have good prospects and have good educational attainment. In fact, when you get to Middleton, 37% of the adults have no qualifications. Across the city, the average is 23%. So there is this big feeling of a 2-speed city. And this is down, in part, to planning, to city planning decisions. The 2 things that have really dictated the fate in terms of connectivity to employment in Middleton is one, an urban motorway that physically separates it from Leeds city centre, but also the tram. There used to be a tram that ran right through the centre of Middleton, and it was part of the original design concept as part of the Garden City Principles of connectivity. And again, that was taken out. Now it's actually very difficult to get by public transport to the jobs. These are things that actually planning can really help tackle, but in this case has created a sense of isolation, whether that's real or perceived. There's questions, but with hindsight, those planning decisions have reinforced that feeling. Again, there's a huge amount of social capital in this community. They've got great community facilities and a huge amount of works going. As part of going on with all kinds of different agencies there, and community groups, and we were lucky enough to spend time with their neighbourhood improvement board. As part of that, we got to speak to local schools, local health professionals, community workers, and it provided a really insightful snapshot about what the community there, thinks of planning. The community thinks, why do we have a proliferation of payday loan shops, of takeaways, of betting shops? Why can't planning do anything about the fact that people are smoking outside the local school, or that there's dog dirt on the floor? And when it comes down to it, the community felt completely disempowered from planning. Why bother engage at all? Rather than seeing it as an opportunity or a force for good. 4th case study that I will quickly whiz through is Tottenham Hale in Haringey in North London. Many of you may have been there if you're on your way out to Stansted to get a flight, or on your way here. Tottenham Hale is brilliantly well connected. It's, you can get the tube into Oxford Circus in 20-25 minutes. You can get the train to Liverpool Street or out to Stansted. But it's got huge social issues. And in terms of planning, for any of you who've been there, it feels like an out-of-town retail park rather than having a hub as a town centre. It's entirely car-dominated. It's very difficult, actually, to get from the station to the out-of-town retail park, which is your main shopping centre, without getting run over. This is completely unnecessary. These were poor planning decisions. But again, what we find is a huge amount of growth going on there, some really, really interesting developments. When we were walking around these developments and meeting people, we were also struck by a level of social segregation. Now, social segregation, which is something that the planning system has consistently sought to avoid throughout its origins, it was always around creating great places for everybody. What we find here is some great public realm, places for kids to play, some very identifiable social housing, and then when you see the private housing, it's gated. Their gardens are manicured and you need a key code to get in. Now that is what the client wanted, but how does it make the community feel? How does it make you feel if you're the kid in that area and you just want to go and sit on the grass for a bit, but you're not allowed because you're not part of that socioeconomic background? There's also some great projects going on. What was really interesting in all of the places we visited was really innovative, exciting community work that is happening. This is a project that is actually in Northumberland Park, the neighbouring ward, which was in the bottom of a massive tower block. And it was about getting kids back into school, getting kids to produce CVs so they can get apprenticeships to get into work. And what was interesting about this is that there is just no money available. This was funded by a housing provider, housing association that was doing great work, but they had to do it in a very innovative way, and there is no public support, and the local authority were not able to put in the resources to actually really make this sort of continue and fly. So great stuff happening, but not on a scale and not with proper support long term. So this project has been really transformational in the thinking of the TCPA, because of course we need growth and of course we need to protect the environment. But have we stopped asking the question, what are these decisions doing to people? How does it make you feel about where you live? There's some very obvious lessons from the research around how, if you cancel a housing market renewal programme a quarter of the way through, it's going to have severe consequences for those communities. But it was really interesting in terms of the lived experience of people in all of those places and how they felt about authority, how they felt about leadership, how they felt about being able to take their destinies into their own hands. And there was a real sense of powerlessness. And we need to do something about that, because planning can be ultimately very powerful for good if you have the right tools and resources. There were 5 key themes that came out of the project. One was sort of the impact of that national policy framework around planning and poverty. Second theme around how the outcomes of planning decisions impacted specifically on communities, and that included corporate social responsibility and working with the private sector, which can be really positive as well. The experiences here weren't, but it can be really positive, and how do we reframe that relationship? The third theme around people and power, around actually who has a say, who takes the leadership, who supports the community participation. A fourth theme around the institutional place of planning, so that relationship between planning and regeneration. And a fifth theme around the culture, morale, and skills of the planning service. And I'm sure that that's a recurring theme. It's a recurring theme everywhere I go at the moment. Actually, planning is a statutory service, but it's being really, really stripped back to the basics because of austerity cuts. So this project is has framed us to think about a new type of way of working, and this is around, should we reinvent social town planning? Now, this is not social engineering. This is not telling people how to live. This is about creating the conditions for people to live happier, healthier lifestyles, to having a really strong understanding that these decisions we make about the built environment can make people's lives better or worse. But this is sent against the context now that planning isn't seen as a positive. Planning is seen as simply a mechanism of allocating land for development. And I think it's up to everybody working in the sector, and certainly not just planners, to reframe the debate. So that's what we're setting out to do over the course of this year, is to run an education and advocacy campaign. So to be out, to engage with planning schools, but to engage with local government, to engage with campaigning organisations that look at social justice, that are looking at employment, at apprenticeships, at innovation, working right across the sector to actually say, what do we want planning to do? And then how do we reframe a planning system so it's fit for purpose? So please join us in the debate. I'm sorry the bottom bit's cut off, but it's at Social Town Plan is our Twitter handle, and Planning for People is the hashtag. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kate. I did warn you that Kate was going to challenge you in terms of the conversation this morning to a very different conversation about the planning system, the social agenda. So hold those questions for the moment. I now have pleasure to introduce Chris. Chris is the director at Core Cities. Chris is going to take us away from what we've been looking at this morning, looking out the window and looking at Westminster and understanding about devolution, and actually trying to move us and understand what needs to happen in other cities away from the southeast and from London. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I completely agree with, no surprise, what Kate was saying, and I think I'd probably argue that in some ways that sense of powerlessness that communities feel is in part a result of a sense of powerlessness that cities and city authorities themselves feel in the face of decades of what you might unkindly describe as infantilisation by successive governments, that what's handed down to one ends up with the other. The core cities are the 10 cities at the centre. We're now 10, we were 8, we were joined recently by Cardiff and Glasgow, at the centre of the largest urban areas and economies in the UK outside of London. They've worked together for 20 years on urban policy and had a significant impact during that time. And collectively, those 10 urban areas now deliver more than 25% of the combined economies of England, Scotland and Wales put together. So that's significantly more than London, and home to 19 million people. So there's a real sense of scale within the network here. We have to talk about housing and rebalancing. And housing, I think, is one of those policy areas and living issues that sits at a kind of crossroads, if you like, of the economic, the social, health and employment issues. And it's critical to get right, therefore, for many different reasons, not just as part of a place's economic offer, but rebalancing housing can't be seen in isolation from, and actually is part of a rebalancing of the national economy. Mainly because housing markets tend to be very intertwined with, even a reflection of, economic conditions locally and nationally. And although there's a bit of chicken and egg about this, I think we've significantly moved on from the build and they will come model as a kind of strategy for urban development. That's not a reliable strategy anymore. I think that previous national programmes have not always recognised that economic link, and I'm really pleased that Kate talked about housing market renewal. So, and it's a programme that many of us were involved with in different ways. It was really important. It made fantastic strides. It was kind of cut off in its prime. But if I do have one criticism of it, it was that it needed to be a wider attempt at market renewal, not just housing renewal, and sometimes the links between housing markets and local economies were not made closely enough as an independent function of local economic conditions. I think there's also been some disconnect on occasion between different national housing programmes, and housing market renewal was run through one stream by one bit of the department, and new build was run by another, and never the twain shall meet. And actually those two things need to come together absolutely in the urban context for you to be able to manage your housing market properly. I think now we have a slightly different underpinning issue, which is that more recent national policy has really sought to solve what is a southeast issue for housing, and then tried to apply that policy in more or less, from a city's perspective, a one-size-fits-all way across the rest of the country, and that has simply not worked. Attempts have been made to resolve that, but again, I think those are partial solutions. For example, splitting housing funds into ever smaller slices of the same pot, which means that cities are then in a position of having to try and stitch those things together, whereas what they really want, what they really need, is maximum flexibility to apply funds in a way which matches local need with local policy tools. Another example, I think, is the disconnect we've got at the moment between the spend on social and affordable housing, which over the last comprehensive spending review period is about £6.5 billion, compared to our spend on housing benefits, which over the same period is about £90 billion. So that clearly needs to be in itself rebalanced in some way. And I'm not saying that is an easy thing to do at all, but we think that with additional financial and policy freedom at the local level, places can begin to tackle those issues as part of a wider programme of economic rebalancing and bringing people closer to the labour market. I also think that the current set of financial incentives that we have and the very limited financial tools that are available to city authorities in this country are not always working well. New Homes Bonus has effectively removed money from most of the core cities, which are largely post-industrial, have all the issues that go with that. They're big economies, but they've got big pools of deprivation and social issues to deal with, and funneled it into more affluent areas where house building is easier and the profits are bigger, but actually those are not the places that are going to drive the future of the nation's economy in our view. They're also not the places that have got the scale and access to brownfield land where building can take place next to existing infrastructure. And of course, Greenbelt is a lot easier in many different ways to build on, but the downstream impacts of that are much greater, the costs are much greater, putting in infrastructure, etc. And that is a big issue for the core cities. Economic rebalancing is sometimes talked about in relation to the balance between private and public sector employment or economic context, but here I'm talking about it clearly, just want to be clear, as a geographic rebalancing away from an over-reliance on London and the South East towards the rest of the nation, and particularly the urban centres. But rebalancing is not the same as redistributing. This is not about pulling apart the success that London has had. You know, it's not about killing the golden goose. It's about trying to create the circumstances in which more places can succeed and fulfil more of the potential. And at the moment, our national economic model, which is enshrined in the model that the Office of Budget Responsibility uses, pretty much says that only so much growth is possible. So whatever you do with public money to try and increase growth in one place, all you're doing is taking it from another. It's redistribution, it's not growing the cake. And we fundamentally disagree with that model, and many economists disagree with that model as well, including people like Jim O'Neill, who chaired the recent RSA Cities Growth Commission, the ex-chairman of Goldman Sachs. One of the reasons that we think that is that it's usual in a developed world for the capital and a bunch of second-tier cities to outperform a national economy. But in the UK, only London and Bristol outperform a national economy currently. That's very untypical. We also know that there's a very strong correlation between the levels of local financial control and the competitiveness and success of cities across the developed world. And to a certain extent, the more local control you've got, particularly over the tax base that's raised locally, the more successful and competitive your city will be. So it isn't just a case that London has had more. Clearly it has, whether you look at that per head of population or per head of economic contribution by population to the nation. I don't think that's really the issue. The critical question is what will allow other cities to exceed the national economic output. If just the 8 English cities came up to the level of the national economic output, that would put 1.3 billion into the economy every year. But independent forecasts that we did with Oxford Economics demonstrate that with additional local controls, those 8 cities could put 222 billion by GVA into the economy and 1.16 million jobs by 2030. And with Glasgow and Cardiff, obviously those figures would be even higher. So in the UK, by comparison, cities control about 5 to 6% of the total tax base raised in them. As a comparison, in Canada, control at the local or regional level is 10 times that amount. It's 50 to 60% of the total tax base. In Germany, it's 6 times that amount. And across the OECD, on average, it's 5 times that amount. So we really are the kind of poor person of our cousins in the developed world in that respect. And that really hamstrings cities. We're fighting a kind of global competition for success with one hand tied behind our back all the time. And that is the one thing I think that would help to rebalance the economy, is to give cities greater financial control. So devolution has been undertaken in part to address that issue, but also as a way of relieving demand pressures on public services when budgets are reducing, which Kate mentioned. I just want to sort of pause briefly on this point. I think it's a critical one. And this graph shows declining local authority, well, in this case, city authority finances. This is the line at the top. That's basically what budgets are doing. And then the line from the dark green upwards is services that authorities are legally obliged to provide, or your statutory services. So you can see that, I mean, all the really fun stuff like growing your economy, having a vibrant culture, investing in communities, which is the light green, is gone by this point here, about 2018. And then further down the line, actually, you can't meet your legal obligations as an authority. So that spending line under any post-election scenario is highly unlikely to increase. So the only way in which you can sustain yourself as a city authority, as a city, is to decrease demand for these services. And this is in particular high demand, high cost services for people who are dependent on public services. We think devolution is incredibly important to that, and I'll give you one example why. In Greater Manchester, combined authority area, 4 years ago, the total public spend across everything, health, education, police, local authority, was £22 billion a year. After 4 years of austerity, it was measured again last year, it's still £22 billion a year. But what's happened is that the budgets which can be managed and cut directly are largely, we've discovered, to do with prevention and frontline. That's local authority services, largely, that stop people falling into dependency. And that spend has increased through reactive budgets, largely on welfare and health. So the way in which those services are managed at the local level is not joined up. And actually the community budget model and other sorts of tools like that, we won't go into at the moment, where basically you join up services in a different way at the local level, have demonstrated that you can manage demand down, you can manage spending down, but not through national diktats. That's got to be designed and delivered at the local level. So another reason for devolution. So back to housing. Housing is firmly on the agenda for devolution. Devolution is not by any stretch the whole of the answer, but it does help in a number of respects. I think the devolution agenda has got a new fire in its belly because of the Scottish referendum. That is devolution to a nation. That will not be necessarily devolution to cities, as Glasgow keeps reminding me. And the SNP agenda is not one of necessarily devolving below the national level. But what it has demonstrated is that I think there's a very strong link between a local sense of identity, local pride, and the freedom to make choices and decisions for your place. And that's very similar to the messages that Kate was providing us with. The devolution deals that we've seen so far I'd describe as functional devolution. That's a devolution of services specific functions and some of the resources and powers to go alongside that. What we have not seen is fiscal devolution or increased fiscal retention at the local level, which is what gives those other cities in other countries the ability to undertake really radical programs of investment and to institute things like tax increment financing and other investment models on a much wider scale than we can here. All these sort of pillars of devolution are very closely linked, and our view is that if you only have access to one or two of these, then the piece won't work. Actually, you need all three to really be able to coordinate investment, reducing demand, growing your economy, and rebalancing housing and reshaping housing markets at the local level. But there are serious challenges to that, and I think one of the biggest domestic challenges facing the next incoming government I describe as a centralisation challenge, which is this. How do you, as a modern state seeking to make your way in the world, to be economically successful at every level, from the global to the neighbourhood, undertake to do that from the centre? And I think the answer is that you can't. Clearly you can't. And in the same way that the nation state is able to broker power and share power globally in order to achieve its aims, we've got to see more of that happening below the national level. And too often we think of any kind of giveaway from nation state below that level as a weakening of a nation state. And we've got to flip that around and think about how we can strengthen a kind of sense of shared state by sharing power at the local level in specific ways for specific outcomes, to strengthen our economies, to reduce demand for public services and therefore spending, and to rebalance the housing market. Because that will in turn enable those tailored local solutions that understand what a place needs to effect better results. I think there's a new economic geography emerging almost in response to that, with things for projects like One North, Midlands Connect, Great Western Cities with Bristol and Cardiff joining together, and new governance mechanisms emerging to help shape that economic narrative, like combined authorities, a different sort of mayor for Greater Manchester and other models. That has shifted the narrative. It creates projects of scale, and it will, I think, in the end, significantly help to rebalance housing markets alongside those new economic geographies. So, just to finish up, what sorts of changes specifically do I think will help rebalance housing as part of that? I think the first is to see housing as central to and not separate from the economic rebalancing agenda. It's clearly a fundamental part of that. The second is to provide places with the freedom to deliver single funds for single plans and strategies that connect economic, spatial and social strategy at the local level. And the third is to link our policy desires to the tools to deliver those policy desires, real incentives, financial freedoms and new innovative financial models that will allow us to actually deliver. And I think that's something you're going to be talking about at this conference tomorrow. I think it was very wise to link the two. I'm sure you've talked this morning about how important cities are globally. They're very important in this country. Some predictions have us at 92% of the population living in an urban base by 2030 in this country. It's a really critical, a very unique moment for the urban agenda in this country. We've recognised that cities are the solution, not the problem. We've recognised a need for rebalancing the economy. We've only just begun, I think, that process of local empowerment. And we now need to move to a much more radical model of devolution and local empowerment to deliver more housing for more people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Stand here rather than sit down. It makes it more interactive, doesn't it? So we've heard from Kate in terms of the power of the planning system. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't get it right. Chris has really put a strong case forward in terms of localism, devolution, and how we need to empower local communities. So questions, those questions you've been saving up. So let's do as we always do and take them in a bit of a batch. Brian, question from the back there.
Brian from Kenny World City Network. We heard a lot this morning about data and how data is transforming the way we plan, the way we work with citizens, kind of enabling kind of bottom-up approach to how we look at cities. I'm curious to know, from some of the challenges you were describing earlier on in terms of some of these neighbourhoods, how much are these kind of tools really changing the way communities can take more control of their environments? And how are we bringing that into the planning system from your point of view?
Do you want to take that question first? Who wants to go first?
So that's more
Go on,
for-
Kate.
Yeah.
Okay.
It all depends on the resources that communities have. I mean, I don't think there can be an assumption that if you're doing a neighbourhood plan, that you also have access to understanding computer modelling. And I think that there's brilliant data out there, and there are some brilliant tools out there, and lots of innovation that's coming forward. And that can be really, really powerful in helping with planning and place shaping. But it's making sure that the right people have access to that and have training and support to actually make the most of that technology. So we've done quite a lot of work around planning for climate change in terms of risk and vulnerability assessment. Works brilliantly at the city level, done lots of work with Manchester, the university there and the council there. And they're great because they'll put in the resources, they have the teams who are up for this agenda. When we now go to smaller towns and cities, there just simply isn't the capacity within the local authority, let alone within the community. So I do think data is really important, but it's about making sure that it's available in a really accessible way. One other point on that is that we use data politically to back up whatever message we're aiming for in terms of political narratives. So again, we see a lot when it comes to planning decisions, data on housing, particularly strategic housing market assessments, not necessarily being used in the most transparent way when we're talking about actual need. So again, having things that are open format, so actually when we're having a conversation, it's a really honest one based on evidence, it would be very welcome in planning.
Well, the only thing I would add is I think that sort of principle of subsidiarity is important in any debate about localism or devolution, that it's not just to city or local authorities, that it has to go beyond that down into communities as well. Otherwise, you just reinforce the kind of dynamic that I described at the beginning where, which is one of kind of infantilization and, kind of bad parenting, really. People need to be empowered to kind of grow up and take control at the local level as well as at the city level.
And I saw a question. Yeah.
Question for Kate, or both Kate and Chris actually, I think. But I'd like to start with Kate and pick up on your reference to the reinvention of the social city. I think that's where it starts, myself. With the challenges ahead of us as far as growth is concerned, housing, and beyond that, or economic basis, I wanted to draw out a little bit more in terms of what you see are the most appropriate city models, the forms of the city that would take us forward with that. Where would you prioritise those to overcome some of these, or to check some of these challenges? And who is the most effective body to deliver this?
That's a big question, isn't it?
That is a very... okay, so...
Taking into consideration the next government as well.
So, yeah, that's a huge question. In terms of reinventing the social city, there are lots of different elements to it. Partly it's about education and practice. So it's about what are we training our future planners to do? What are their ethics and how are they held to account? Having the responsibility then, if you go into public office, to then say, this is actually the advice that we're giving, based on having a very solid ethical value behind that. And we've lost that confidence, we've lost that bravery, and we've lost that vision in planning in a big way. But it's also about the legal structures and the policy. If you look at the National Planning Policy Framework and you search the words equality, equity, social justice, poverty, exclusion, this isn't in the narrative, it's not in our policy framework, and we don't have any guidance on that either. So partly it's about policy, partly it's about legislation, but mostly it's about practice and ethics. There are great examples of places that are doing really good social value planning, lots across Europe when you go to places like Freiburg. great examples in other parts of Germany in terms of municipalization of energy and community cooperatives. We can do this, but it also requires political will. Could be a very big answer. Do you want to touch on that?
Should I just briefly?
Go on.
Have we got time?
Go on, Chris.
I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's a potentially very long answer, but I would agree with Lewis Mumford when he said very long time ago that actually cities should be structured around their social centres and social networks, and not the other way around. That you structure your social networks around the infrastructure, and that's, the best cities have kind of accreted their infrastructure around those social networks in a way. And I think there is an opportunity to do that consciously as well as unconsciously. But I'm not sure that we know. Actually, context is really important in this respect. You can get away with a hell of a lot in London that you couldn't get away with in different kind of socioeconomic contexts. It just wouldn't work. And you know, design quality is, I think, a huge issue when you get outside of London as well. But I do wonder whether we actually, even if we agreed on all of those points, understand enough about the way in which the way we make cities impacts back on us in ways that are quite difficult to fathom sometimes, you know, on our psychologies and our modes of behaviour. And there is some interesting work taking place on that, but it's very much at the edge of this sort of debate, you know, where the neuroscientists are wiring people up and walking them around cities and measuring their reactions to different kinds of urban environments. And there's a sort of urban psychology movement emerging in the United States, which I think has got a lot to say about this. But that feels to me so far removed from the desperation to get development going in a lot of other cities that you know, it feels like a huge risk actually.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. I know there's more questions, but I'm going to stop there because I want to thank Chris and Kate for an excellent series of presentations. So can you thank them in a little way? Thank you.